Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where people are joining from. I'm very glad to be able to introduce this discussion on behalf of the Centre for Global Development and Refugees International. Thank you all very much for being here today. And thank you especially to Jocelyn Perry of Refugees International and to our excellent panel for what I'm sure will be a fascinating and extremely useful discussion. This is a discussion which is taking place under the Labour Market Access Research Programme, which is a joint programme hosted by Refugees International and by the Centre for Global Development. This programme was born out of the recognition that most of the world's 29 million refugees and forced migrants face barriers, both de jure and de facto, which limit their ability to freely work, move, and thrive. It has four key areas of focus: sustainable financing, physical location, social cohesion and public attitudes to refugees, and climate. Climate overlaps with and interacts with all of these three first areas. But the impacts of climate change on migration, which have broadly received enormous attention and have been the subject of a vast number of studies, will also impact displaced populations. Despite this, they have received very little attention in the context of refugees. Those who have already been forced to move by conflict across international borders are often more exposed to climate shocks than other populations because states place them in less desirable areas, and they may also be more vulnerable. They may lack the right to work, and they may have limited resources. They may also have less political capital and be less prioritized by the hosting country. In a study conducted by CGD and by Refugees International under the Labour Market Access Programme, we found that refugees are omitted from almost all national adaptation plans. Migration is often included in these plans. 42 of 49 NAPs do include mobility, but refugees are not included. Only 6 national adaptation plans mention refugees, and only 2 national adaptation plans include concrete policies when doing so. These are the key climate adaptation documents determining which populations receive funding and support against climate shocks. But because of this omission, over 15 million refugees and other persons in need of international protection are in countries which do not take account of their adaptation needs. So we're delighted that this event is taking place, and we hope that it will create more conversation around this neglected area and that it will drive this issue up the agenda. And we're looking forward to an informative, quick-fire discussion on a range of key subjects that we think will cast more light on this important nexus. So I will now pass back to Jocelyn Perry, who will be moderating, and look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm Jocelyn Perry, Senior Advocate and Program Manager from Refugees International. It's a pleasure to have you all here today and to be partnering with CGD on this wonderful event. Refugees International advocates for life-saving assistance, human rights, and protection for displaced populations around the world and promotes solutions to displacement crises. We believe that people experiencing displacement must be at the center of the movement to advance solutions to it, and we are dedicated to expanding the space for refugee and local leadership in our organization, in the public sphere, and in the halls of power. To ensure the independence and credibility of our work, Refugees International does not accept government or UN funding, which allows us to advance accountability and allows us to speak freely when others sometimes cannot. With that introduction, I want to move to our esteemed panelists. You may see we're a bit of a Brady Bunch today, so we're hoping for a different type of conversation, a different type of webinar where we're not having 10 or 15-minute speeches, but a conversation and some quick-fire responses to a number of questions. So I will start in alphabetical order with Evan Easton-Calabria, who is Senior Researcher at Tufts University, and then Jason Gagnon, Senior Economist and Head of the Migration and Skills Unit at the OECD Development Center, Ayo Irene Helen, Partnership Officer with Last Mile Climate and South Sudanese refugee who's lived her whole life in Uganda. Then we've got Jamin Vandenhoek, Associate Professor at Oregon State University, followed by Kiamuddin Ikram, who is an alumni fellow with Refugees International and a youth climate activist from Afghanistan. Finally, turning to Lillian Kilwake, who is the Gender and PSEA Program Specialist with the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, followed by Atle Solberg, Head of Secretariat with the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and Michelle Yonatani, Senior Policy Officer at the Office of the Special Advisor to the High Commissioner on Climate Action with the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And so I want to start the discussion with a topic for Kiamuddin in terms of whether refugees are exposed to climate hazards differentially. Are they located in disproportionately exposed areas? And what is known about their exposure broadly? Kiamuddin, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for asking this question as I'm currently writing on this topic. I'm asking and doing surveys with refugees recently affected by the floods in Pakistan. And I was doing this research in terms of the 2022, like 22 flood. So I think it depends on the location. So I have like my own experience living in those refugee camps. And in terms of the location, most of the refugee camps and settlements are located in vulnerable regions, slopy areas, on slopes and undesirable conditions, like undesirable places. And some of the camps that I have recently surveyed as well, they are very near to the proximity of the rivers. And during such floods, they are really and highly exposed to those floods. And also the camp, the camp construction is also another point as well, because most of these camps are, and most of the houses is built of because of the temporary materials like muds. So it is really, it makes the camp more exposed to such disasters. And also you see that a lot of lack of infrastructure are also in place in such camps, like they don't have early warning system. They also don't have such trainings for preparedness for such climate disasters. And also they don't have like a proper water supply and sanitation services. And these existing conditions, I think they further exacerbate the existing vulnerability of those refugees in those camps, and they make them more exposed to such disasters.
Thank you so much. And I'd like next to turn to Evan to share briefly a Climate Center project on this topic as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, also very grateful that we're having a webinar on this topic, and kind of zooming out from what you just shared, Kiamuddin. At the Red Cross Climate Center, which I also work with, we've really been asking this question and trying to combine climate data and just what is known about the actual locations of forcibly displaced people down to the camp, settlement, urban area level, in recognition that we can know that there are broad climate risks, which there are in all countries, but it actually really matters where people actually are in terms of understanding what the risks are, right? Like there can be a high flood risk in an area, but if a camp isn't by a river, does that matter? Or a low flood risk, but a camp is by a river, so maybe it doesn't matter. So there's a project that we'll be launching in about a month ahead of, or a few weeks ahead of World Refugee Day, that's been looking at 43.2 million people in the top refugee and IDP hosting countries, and really looking again down to that local level. And I'd say none of us will be surprised to know that every single person exposed to at least one hazard, 95% of forcibly displaced people exposed to 2 hazards, and then a lot of IDPs who are the most exposed overall, exposed in general to 3 hazards. And maybe just one kind of other takeaway from that is really just thinking about kind of that multi-hazard exposure, like what does that actually mean? And what it means is, you know, it's flood in one season, it's drought, and then a cyclone in another. And I really come back to thinking about the exposure in terms of people's conditions of camps, or, as you just mentioned, of non-durable shelter in a lot of these places where we're not allowed to build durable shelter for people and they can't build it for themselves. So there's a huge risk and huge exposure. And I'd say Somalia and Afghanistan, just to kind of put two places in your head, those were the places where 11 sites where IDPs were exposed to every single thing that we looked at. So that was historical drought, historical flood, historical fire risk, it's future drought, and so on. So there are extremely exposed places in the countries that need the most attention overall.
Thank you, Evan, and also thank you for highlighting IDPs as well. I wanted to be sure that when we're saying refugees exposure to climate risk, we are talking about refugees who are often differentially affected by various freedom of movement, work permit, adaptation restrictions, but we're also talking about IDPs and other displaced populations as well. So we're not being exclusive to refugees in this webinar. And now, Jamin, I want to turn to you to give us a little bit more granular detail on what is known about refugees exposure. How does it vary place to place? And then this difference between, are refugees more likely to be exposed to climate shocks than IDPs? Are there differences there that we should be cognizant of? Over to you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And thanks, Evan, for the nice lead in. We've done, well, I don't think we have the full story. I think it's clear that it's extremely variable. I think the common conception is that refugees are encamped, but globally, most refugees live in urban areas. So that question of intra-urban vulnerability or exposure is a very difficult one to address with the kind of data we have right now. While we have locations provided by the UNHCR and others on where refugees live globally, we don't know where in which cities refugees live in, and in very large cities with extreme differences in topography, extreme differences in infrastructure, that, as just following what everyone was saying, that really matters. That local place really matters. So I think we're, to be honest, quite blind systematically as to the exposure of urban refugees and urban IDPs. This is really important because many populations that are displaced multiple times go from city to city to city, or camp to city. They're in a sense the most difficult and the most vulnerable and the most difficult to monitor because of their sheer vulnerability, right? So it's a big question mark on that level. Most of the work has been done on rural camps, and there are a couple of studies that have been published that have a region or a global level picture. Those studies, I think, together paint a picture of overall exposure of refugees to climate and environmental hazards, but not in a uniform way. Like our study from last year that we published over East African refugee camps, we found that really was just the very largest of the camps in Kenya, actually the second largest in population, Kakuma. That in our study, using our assessment of overall exposure, had the greatest exposure of other East African refugee camps across Kenya, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania. But we don't really know what's happening within that camp, Kakuma, within sort of neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community within, population by population within Kakuma, household by household. We don't know what's happening there. Flood risk could vary for very locally varying reasons. We don't have those data in a consistent way to make those kind of assessments. So while Kakuma did have overall higher exposure, the rest of our camps that we looked at, the refugee populations that we looked at, were actually much more in sort of the middle distribution of exposure compared to other settlements in the regions. or they had actually at the low end of the exposure. So these are counterintuitive, but I think or maybe not counterintuitive, but they go against the grain of this sort of assumption of refugees always having this greater exposure. But it's important to take note of these differences. If all refugee camps are all uniformly exposed, how do we prioritize? How do we allocate resources differently, right? There are important differences to take note of, and there are especially important differences to take note of in refugee communities that are seeing less exposure, or that perhaps have, for whatever combination of reasons, perhaps greater means of adaptation or mitigation. These potential success stories are really important to highlight. It's not just the worrisome overarching scenario. Overall, a lot needs to be done, but we have this variation that we really do need to keep track of well, so that we can understand how best to allocate to resources, aid, mitigation, vulnerability, adaptation plans. And I think we're really just at the beginning of understanding this variation in a systematic way.
Absolutely. And I want to bring Michelle in here as our UNHCR representative to talk to what we know about why this exposure might vary, how UNHCR is thinking about working with states on exposure of refugees, and what you're seeing in terms of what states are doing that might be limiting adaptive capacity for refugees, and what states might be doing that's supporting refugees in the face of climate shocks. And later on, I'm going to ask you about the climate. No need to bring it. You can bring it in here if you want, but.
Thanks, Jocelyn. That's a lot of questions, right? In a quick fire round. I'll try and keep it short, but all great. But first of all, thank you so much indeed to join the others in saying thank you for even convening this discussion. Super important indeed for a topic that hasn't received as much attention as it needs yet. So we're really appreciating the work of everybody here on the call today, what we're all doing. I think just even going back to thinking about the data that's out there, where the gaps are, what we do and don't know, there is indeed a lot to do. I mean, UNHCR has been working, for example, very closely last couple of years with CGIAR, as some of you will know. So really bringing in all that sort of agricultural land sort of expertise, bringing in climate models, overlaying it with the refugee settlement data that Hammond was also referring to, but indeed that only tells us so much. So we're trying out different things, and I think the key thing that we need to say here is that we need knowledge or data in different forms for different purposes. There's the stuff we're using that's sort of the broad, like 70% of refugees we're showing are originating from countries which are highly climate vulnerable, for example, right? So that's very, very broad. At the same time, we've been trying out, like working with UNOSAT with satellite data, for example. We looked at like 25 settlements, getting much more high resolution, really much more high resolution, more detailed information. 25 settlements, 1 million people in different countries, and 3 different countries, excuse me, and looking at the implications of climatic hazards for different sectoral areas of need, right? So whether it's shelter or clean cooking or climate smart water and sanitation systems, solarization of boreholes, all different types. So we're really thinking of it not only from the broad advocacy point of view in terms of why we need this information, but also how it can directly inform our operations to strengthen the resilience to climatic hazards in each specific situation. Absolutely agreeing with the points being made by colleagues here that it's very context specific. And of course, that applies equally for the governance context in which we find these camps, not only context specific in terms of the individual needs of refugee populations who, of course, are not a homogeneous block, but have very different needs among them. So from a protection point of view, if you will, women, children, and so on. But also the governance situation, indeed, the situation in terms of things like you've already mentioned, the freedom of movement for refugees, the access to livelihoods, to what extent they're able to exercise, to what extent they can be included, if you like, in livelihoods, with local communities, whether they're in an encamped type situation, or whether indeed, as as Gemma also was saying, in an urban situation, it's so context specific, and to really act and to really work on policy and make change, we absolutely need that resolution of understanding. And that means all kinds of data, including qualitative data, including analysis of very specific needs. So I think I'll stop there, but trying to just keep the conversation going. I hope that is what you're looking for. Thanks, Jocelyn.
That's great. Thank you, Michelle. And I want to turn to Ayo next. Ayo, if you can tell us a bit more about refugees' special vulnerability to climate shocks and what factors might make them more or less vulnerable, whether freedom of movement, work permits, shelter support. How have you seen this in your life?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Just imagine enduring heat wave under 10. It's hard. So most refugees in Uganda still live under tents. And that really exposed them to a lot of risk and climate crisis. And location of refugee settlements in Uganda, they are quite in remote areas where there are poor infrastructures, there are no specialized medical healthcare services, that in case of climate crisis, at least refugees can get some support. And maybe also, support from the government. If anything happened in the settlement, it will be quite hard for even rescue team to reach in those settlements. In terms of freedom of movement in Uganda, there's really inclusive policies around the refugees allowed to move, but also moving without jobs. What does it mean, right? Of course, the policies allows refugees in Uganda to work, but sincerely, refugees in Uganda, 90% don't work. And this exposed them to risk and a lot of things. And I love the fact that we have representative from UNHCR. We know that food for refugees has been reduced to 60%. So refugees move out of the settlement in search of food and wood fuel. And in Uganda, 80% of refugees are women and children. That makes them more vulnerable. And in case of climate crisis, they can respond so quickly and they can adapt. It's quite hard. So I'm giving all examples in Uganda context because this is where I'm born and raised. Despite a lot of efforts from different humanitarian organizations and refugee-led organizations as well, and government of Uganda, but I think there's still gaps around work permit, shelter, and refugees themselves are also doing a lot. If you go to camp like Lamwa in Uganda, it is in a rocky place where you can't grow any kind of food. It's not fertile at all, but the refugee-led organization are trying so much to engage refugee community in agricultural activities. And I think that is where we are moving toward. And we really have to help support through direct funding for refugee-led organizations because they're the one on front line. They're the one that support their community. And as Last Mile Climate, we really advocate for direct funding for refugee-led organizations because they're really doing a lot. Good examples, I can give you an example. During COVID, international organization all left. Those who were here locked themselves inside. It was only refugee-led organization trying to run up and down to support. So there's really need to support. And also as much as there are policies, but some policies are not inclusive enough. So we should also have inclusive policies that can, support refugees when climate crisis happens, like last year in Moyo, the whole camp was flooded, and nothing was done because the policy in Uganda, some policies does not support refugees, and most time when climate crisis happen, and prioritize the needs of the local people over refugees. And that is also something we need to advocate for, because we are all human beings. So if something happen like floods or droughts, we have to respond to both community, because humanitarian organizations support both host community and the refugee communities. So also government should do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo.
I'll be happy to answer more questions if there are questions.
Yes, we have a couple in the Q&A already that I think will be addressed to you. Kiamuddin, can I turn to you quickly to also address, maybe from your perspective, the recent work you've been doing in Pakistan, whether refugees are more vulnerable in addition to being more exposed, and what might be done to help?
Thank you once again. Yeah, refugees are, I think, often vulnerable to climate shocks and climate crisis in Pakistan. If we see the recent flooding in Pakistan, I think there were IDPs, but the refugees, they are more vulnerable to such disasters because of the limited resources they have. They are poor people, so they live with the existing poverty. They don't have they're the daily labor wages. Most of them, they're selling vegetables. Few of them, they work with the hosting communities in the agriculture sector. So I think they depend, on their daily wages. So if there is any disasters or something, so they will directly affect their livelihoods. And if they don't have a livelihood, income, so definitely they will be more vulnerable to such conditions. So again, they also, as mentioned by Ayo, definitely the refugees, they are restricted to the camps. They don't have freedom to move. And also they also don't have they don't have the right to live outside of those camps, because the state will not give the right to them to build their own house, like a resilient house, a little bit far from the disaster prone areas. So all of these factors, they will give a little bit more vulnerability to those refugees to such a disaster.
Thank you so much. And I want to turn to Atle now. In terms of the work of the PDD and how you're supporting all populations in displacement, in disaster preparedness and response efforts, if there are particular vulnerabilities for people who might already be living in displacement, and then might be subject to climate shocks or disasters, and then how that work intersects with your broader disaster displacement support work.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and congratulations for this webinar, and to the previous speaker. I was wondering what you were going to ask me for, so I think that's a great great question. I also liked the way we have pitched that all people displaced do face specific vulnerabilities for the fact that they are not in their homes and in their place of origin. And I think that generates specific vulnerabilities, but not always equally. As we heard from Jamin, there might be refugees that are at less risk than host communities or other populations. I think that's very important to unpack that. I do think that one, and I wanted to maybe highlight this, that one vulnerability comes from the fact that when people are on the move, they are not really that easy to include in national development planning. And clearly, if you are about to adapt to climate change, that is essential and a development challenge for any country, whether these are internally displaced persons or whether we're talking about refugees. And it's hard. And I heard from Sam, and I agree, refugees are not really included in national adaptation plan, but it's not that everyone else is well included of displaced person. It is a huge challenge to get people on the move to be included in national adaptation plans and also in disaster risk management strategies. So it's about also shifting the approach from what is very often humanitarian, short-term, outside of the state, and really to bring the government and the states into the center of this. Because quite a lot of adaptation planning, adaptation financing are channels through the state. So we need to fix that by getting this into national adaptation planning and national development plans and get the state in, and also to be able to then focus on solutions. And this is another complicating factor. For any country, a development plan will have a very strong focus on solution for the population. And there is a risk, of course, for a refugee population to not be seen as part of that equation. So it's also important to have the solution approach. So maybe my key point with what I wanted to say, very, very much adding to my previous colleagues, is the inclusion into national development planning and getting the governance at the center. And I think that is the trick to really have this inclusion. And whether people are IDPs or refugees, conflict displaced or displaced by climate change in itself or in the context of Israel, doesn't really matter. It's that specific needs they have in being included in national development planning. So thank you, Jocelyn, for that.
Thank you, Atle. And that's really helpful in turning to our next set of questions, which will focus a bit more on adaptation programming and financing, both writ large and specifically in support of refugees, IDPs, and other displaced populations. So I want to turn to Lillian, who's based in Nairobi with UNICEF, to ask how organizations are supporting refugees in adapting to climate shock. And after that, I'd like to turn to Michelle to hear a bit more about the Climate Resilience Fund as well. To Lillian, to you.
Yeah, good afternoon from Nairobi. It's 5:33 p.m. here in Nairobi. Tomorrow is a UN holiday, so everyone has left the office happily with their bags. But I told them I'm in a very important panel, so they can enjoy the holiday.
Thank you for working late for us on a holiday.
No, it's on 1st of June is Kenya's Independent Day, so it's been brought backwards by a day for the UN family. Yeah, so just a quick introduction on myself. I was already introduced by Jocelyn Perry. My current role is Gender and PSCA Officer, Specialist, sorry. And I'm also covering disability. I'm supporting the office on that. But what is important also is for the last 8 years up to March this year, I worked with the displacement issues in the Horn of Africa. So they remain quite passionate to me. And I always feel like I belong to displacement and all that. But I also follow my heart to work on gender equality, which is my master's and my PhD. Yeah, so in terms of organizations, I could mention what UNICEF is doing. UNICEF is a child-focused organization, and they have done a great job in working on climate and environment issues. We have partnered with the government of Kenya and created a very innovative interactive dashboard. I'll share with Jocelyn and she can share with participants. This is only for Kenya because I'm based in the Kenya country office, where you can go to that dashboard and interact with all areas in Kenya. When you click, you see all aspects of disaster risk, climate risk, and environment and health risk for the children in those areas. So it's quite interactive, and from there, you can actually use the information for programming, advocacy, and all that. So I think from the question that I was posed for is how organizations are dealing with it. So from a UNICEF perspective, we are mapping out how climate change and environmental issues affect children in Kenya. So at least we have a digital geospatial map. It's a very interactive cartographic tool. So that's what we are doing here. Yeah, so I think I answered the question on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from Michelle as well. We've recently seen the UNHCR's Climate Resilience Fund be launched, and so I'm interested in hearing a bit more about what that will be focusing on, who that funding will be available to, and to what end you hope to achieve with that.
It's over to me then?
Yes, sorry, over to you, Michelle. And I keep asking you 4 questions at once. Apologies.
So what's this climate resilience fund? Yeah, thanks for spotting that one. I think what I would say is like, yes, we agree with everything everybody's saying that, absolutely, there needs to be a greater understanding, appreciation of the particular vulnerabilities faced by refugee and IDP populations in relation to the impacts of climate change. And this is something that we can hear. The knowledge, the data is there's a lot of it out there actually already, but there are very important gaps, especially when we get down to really getting that analysis of very specific populations and situations and being able to turn that into actually programs, into action, into delivery on the ground with results. And for UNHCR, we see that very much as part of what we're already doing. So it's not something that's separate. We don't see climate and displaced populations as a separate group of people. We're talking about climate as a risk multiplier, as a vulnerability multiplier, as something which is increasing protection needs. So what this resilience fund is about, it's about trying to, because also donors, frankly, have got a lot, many of them have a lot more interest these days in thinking about how they can contribute to resilience to climate change amongst highly vulnerable populations. And as we're all saying, refugees in very different ways, in different contexts, are very often part of those particularly vulnerable groups, right? So the fund is basically trying to provide a better channel and attention from donors also to the fact that we're not just talking about a separate group of people, but people who are in very vulnerable situations, often living alongside or with host communities who are often in equally or similarly vulnerable situations, depending on the situation. And this is a way to try and bring greater attention, greater resourcing to improve, if you like, across the board, but also in some really focused countries, the transformation of our programming. So making sure that climate risk is absolutely integrated into everything that we're doing, whether it's in water and sanitation work, or in shelter, in community-based engagement and preparedness and so on. We have to build this in, and we have no choice. So that's what the fund is about. It's about bringing the greater attention. What it is not, I'm afraid, just to temper expectations, is already this huge pot of gold that's suddenly been created. Right? It's not something you can just apply to as such. It's very much about a channel trying to bring the funding in to enhance that area of programming so that all of the partners, especially our attempts to really increase the number of local NGOs, local civil society organizations, who are able to then access, in this case, it would be through UNHCR in terms of the funding that's coming down and through us. But at the same time, you see, there's the fund there, but we're also doing a lot of advocacy, because we see it's just as important is to advocate for the greater inclusion of refugees and their host communities, and IDPs and their host communities into the existing programming that's going on. And indeed, as Atla was also saying, that they're just quite often being left out, either because they're dynamic populations on the move, they're not registered in the area where the plan or the program is being conducted and made, for example. That's kind of an almost practical point, but also to do with status and visibility very much in terms of governance of some populations, which is tantamount to discrimination in some situations. So that's what the fund is there to do. So I would see it as something that's really trying to enhance what we're doing with some very specific things as well. And this is something I should add, is something that I think donors, UN agencies, partners across the board are trying to figure out. It's a bit like a mainstreaming question. It's a bit like when we started talking about gender more seriously in terms of how you mainstream it. So it's a separate issue. It needs specific attention, but we also have to integrate it into everything we're doing. It's about changing how we do business, how we work. So it's both those things, and that fund is trying to support both. I hope that helps to increase understanding of what it is and what it isn't. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And we've just heard a bit from Ayo and Kiamuddin on how it's not just access to work regulations that are important, but also availability of work opportunities, which in a lot of refugee self-reliance efforts relies on very climate exposed industries like agriculture. So I want to turn to Evan here to ask what impact climate shocks might have on refugee self-reliance efforts, as well as on humanitarian organizations and other efforts to support them.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to say thanks, Michelle, for explaining about that. And I have to say, for years, I think it's just been kind of Andrew Harper in the background trying to talk and be sort of the voice for UNHCR on climate change. And I really see that that's changing in the last even year. I think a lot more work has come out, and yeah, it's great to hear more about that. And I'll look into the fund. Yeah, so I'd say I kind of entered into the discussion on kind of climate risk for refugees through my work on refugee self-reliance and livelihoods, because I, over the last 10 plus years, have been talking with refugees and realizing more and more people are bringing climate into the discussions in terms of their challenges. So I'd say we probably know the answer in some sense, and we need to get much more of the data to back it up in terms of those impacts. You know, the refugees I've worked with in the Nakivale settlement in Uganda are saying, you know, our harvests, they're dropping. And, you know, elsewhere, people are saying, I worked for 5 years to build a business and the flash flood, you know, swept it away in an hour or less. So we're seeing these impacts. And I actually have just completed a pilot project with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, which some of you may know about, and you should know about them if you don't. Really trying to look also from the perspective of agencies that are doing self-reliance programming for refugees and IDPs to better understand to what extent are climate considerations just coming into their work. So again, to that, speaking of mainstreaming, right, of just how are those being thought about? So I spoke with, it was 3 different agencies or 5 different agencies, 3 different countries in East Africa, and looked through plans and concept notes and so on, and talked with different staff. And I'd say it was interesting because climate doesn't seem to be systematically considered. So there weren't some things that I would say are quite basic and needed at this point in time and going forward in terms of climate risk assessments that are quite detailed. Again, speaking to some of our earlier conversation of, you know, are we in a floodplain and what does that look like? And what do the forecasts say for this season, but also going out 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So a lot of that isn't happening. But there's some kind of individual, more ad hoc good practices that I think are important for us to build on. So there's a brief that's coming out in the next month. I feel like this webinar is coming like a month behind everything that'll be published for World Refugee Day. But really just trying to think more concretely of what are the changes that need to happen. So I'd say something that was interesting out of that more concretely as well is a lot of the cash-based assistance graduation approach, not much seems to be being tweaked. And this, again, this is pilot. The aim is to then expand based on what we found and didn't find. With that in mind, I think that's an area that there's a lot more to think about. And that's where I would say there's a really strong linkage that could be happening and should be happening to anticipatory actions. So really trying to use the climate data, the forecasting capacities that we in the broader sense have, and link that to providing larger, you know, cash assistance before a flood or so on. And that has a direct impact on people's livelihoods, and more than just livelihoods, right? But people were saying, you know, the food prices go up, but so does everything else when there's a really bad season. So that means our businesses aren't as productive because we can't buy as much in order to sell, and, you know, all of this. So there's a lot to think about. And I'd say one of my current life goals is really to kind of expand some of those climate discussions that, as Michelle was saying, kind of were happening much more in silos, and bring those more into the discussions on livelihoods and self-reliance. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think that's critical. And Io, I want to turn to you next. We have a couple audience questions that I'll combine to ask to you. Around, it seems like women and children are more affected. Do you have any more information on this, how women and children are differentially affected? And then what different support or more support do the efforts that refugees are already leading in their communities need from the international community or from national governments, including how direct funds could be targeted to RLOs to address issues related to the climate crisis?
Thank you, Perry, for that question. I think what refugees need as support, one is employment opportunity, because if I'm employed, in case of climate crisis, I'll be respond and support my family. We need international organizations to employ refugees so that refugees are able to depend on themselves, not humanitarian organizations. And I would also talk in terms of funding for local initiatives that support response to climate crisis within the refugee hosting district and countries. For example, in Uganda, the refugees made a pledge during GRF to plant about 7.5 million trees. How will this come to reality if there are no resources? So we need resources to support those kind of initiatives so that refugees are able to support themselves. And also, I think we should invest more in sustainable farming practices to support the refugee livelihood. It's very important because due to lack of food and climate crisis, refugees are moving back. If you go to bus terminal in the evening, you see how many refugees are going back to Congo, back to South Sudan, back to their countries. And this is exposing them more to other risks. People, prioritizing safety over anger, because if I can run and hide somewhere and have food, better than to be in a place where I can't get food at all. So we should invest more in refugee livelihood and probably also have refugees in decision making. When you're doing a research, please include them so that their voice is heard, so that you get the right information, because we understand our needs better than anybody. In Uganda, we say nothing about us without us. So you can't be working for refugees when you can't have them with you. So we need to employ refugees. We need to advocate for policy inclusions. We need more resources for refugee-led organizations and also humanitarian organizations that operate in Uganda. They're really doing a lot. And these are organizations that should receive funding and support refugees in Uganda, because now, as I speak, we are about 1.7 million, and a lot of refugees are entering every day. And the last thing I would also mention is about shelter. Refugees can't survive under tents or tarpaulins for a year. It's not possible because flood can come anytime, droughts, heat waves, like what happened in March just few months ago. So at least we need to work on the issue of shelter, at least if we can do a temporary, semi-permanent for refugees. I think, yeah, for me, that's what I think we should work on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's all critical. And we know Uganda is in fact developing its national adaptation plan right now. And we would really like to see and need to see refugees included in consultations for that. I want to turn to Jason actually on this topic as to whether refugees and other displaced persons are adequately included in national adaptation plans, as well as local adaptation planning, as well as in disaster risk reduction. And then Atle, curious to hear your thoughts on the disaster risk reduction piece afterwards as well. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jocelyn, and thanks for the invitation to everyone. So the table's set because we've received a wealth of really interesting input so far, and so it's I guess it's my turn to kind of zoom out a little bit and think of what's the big picture on whether refugees are adequately integrated in national adaptation planning. And we did at the OECD, and with partners, we did this exercise very similar to the one that Sam presented earlier, and we looked at national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions to see how forced displacement was referenced in these plans. And what we found is, very similar to what Sam Huckstep was presenting earlier, about little over than 1/3 of them even reference forced displacement in any shape or form. And when we look a little bit deeper, it looks pretty good. It looks better for national adaptation plans, where there's about 74% that do reference. The issue was more the nationally determined contribution side, where there's about 26% references to forced displacement. But then we found three general, I think, important findings from that. One was that when we looked at very specific concrete provisions that were included in them, the numbers significantly fall. So things that were actionable. And on the National Adaptation Plan, there's only about half of them, about 48% that have some sort of concrete provisions that they can act on for the inclusion, for the preparation, and 14% of 14% only of nationally determined contributions. We also found that, and this is very much related to this question, that the most underrepresented group in here was actually a very surprising group, which is the pre-existing displaced persons, which everybody has already said are marginalized and vulnerable in these situations. And there are very few. I think Sam also underlined this as well. There are very few plans that that pick this up in any way, shape, or form. 4% of nationally determined contributions and 27% of the national adaptation plans. And that number, again, if we filter through provisions again, concrete provisions and actionable points, falls even lower. So 17% of national adaptation plans and only 2% of national determined contributions. So really, it's a group that isn't in any way represented in planning specifically on preparations for climate change and vulnerable situations related to the environment. Just to give you a very quick picture of what the concrete provisions may have looked like in the few where we did find them, there were mentions of human rights and protection of human rights. There was mentions of managing potential conflict that could come with being exposed. There were the importance of vulnerability assessments, the issue of mainstreaming, and one last one was how these groups' vulnerabilities are combined over many other types of vulnerabilities that are pre-existing in their livelihood settings. Just one last point on this, and just because I really enjoyed reading South Sudan's National Adaptation Plan, because it was very well structured, and this is one of the few countries that really puts a lot of emphasis on pre-existing displaced persons in their 2021 National Adaptation Plans. They highlight that it's amongst one of the most vulnerable climate groups. And I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of, in the adaptation planning in South Sudan, there's a lot of pre-preparation about what that might mean for them in terms of mainstreaming their vulnerabilities, not only in national adaptation planning, but how it might look like if they were brought into more development planning more generally at the national level.
Thank you so much. And especially in the area of disaster risk reduction, I wanted to turn over to Atle to see how this is being thought about in the adaptation sphere, as well as inclusion of considerations around displacement in disaster preparedness and response.
So thank you, Jocelyn. I see that we don't have much time. So I don't sit on the same set of hard and good data that Jason just shared with us on the inclusion in NDCs and NAPs, but we have also done quite a lot on the inclusion of displacement into disaster risk management strategy. And there is also a shortfall of that specific inclusion. There might be references, and then if you dig a little further, there is not really actionable provision that assigns responsibility, or more importantly, funding. So I think one key message from what we are promoting is to continue that inclusion, and every time you have a revision of a disaster risk management strategy in a country, to support countries for having that inclusion. I think if you don't have that, you will also see that funding will not be forthcoming, and you will also then see that there's lack of an institutional framework for that inclusion. So you will not really get traction at the national level. I do think, and congratulating Jason and his team for his work, is that you need to have some of this international adaptation plan, because that is where financing will come in, and Development Bank and Global Fund, they will speak to those plans. So unless it's there, it's very hard to advocate for that funding. And I think that's back to what I said earlier, why displaced people have a tendency to fall through the crack, either because they're not citizens of that country, or as Michelle said, maybe they're not even be registered in that area. So these are challenging. So I have one more comment, but I really would like to respect the 4 minutes that are left also to other colleagues to come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Atle. And I want to give the floor over for our last couple of comments to Kiamuddin and then close out with Ayo. So Kiamuddin, in terms of what you think is needed in refugee representation, inclusion in planning, financing, or amplifying refugee voices. We have a question from the audience about what, in 1 or 2 minutes, do you think the next steps we all here should take?
Yeah, one of the audience asked this question, that the recent flash floods affected a lot of people in Afghanistan. So the information is not shared with the UN agencies and other NGOs. So I think actually the landscape of that area, when I observed, I think it is in the valley, So I think it's just a lack of planning. So, and the de facto government authority is not giving any support to such to those people. So I think, as also Ivan also said, that anticipatory action is really important, and that is missing. The early warning system is missing. The anticipatory information given to such community is also missing for such disasters. So I think, and overall, generally, climate change is like intensifying the refugee crisis, and we must ensure that those most vulnerable are not left behind, supporting them through livelihood opportunities, providing them DRR trainings, and also by, inclusion of refugees and climate adaptation plans, and also climate policies, and climate discussions and negotiations is really important. And through these things, we can build a more resilient future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to acknowledge the recent flooding in Bangladesh as well, as we've had several comments and questions come through about the situation in Bangladesh for refugees, location in exceptionally climate exposed areas, as well as the really horrific effects on human lives, health, livelihoods, and more due to the flooding. And I want to turn finally to Ayo. With that flooding, we know disaster response is necessary, but it's not enough. So going into policy change, what would you recommend ahead of the Bonn mid-year meetings and COP29 that are taking place this year to advocate for, to further support refugees in the climate emergency? Ayo, to you.
Thank you. Before going to COP29, let me first start from home. What I think should be done, first we have to work closely with the local government and probably build their capacity so that they're able to involve refugee in their planning meetings, or at the district level, because local government in Uganda are the one that can respond quickly when anything happens, because they're nearer to refugees. But I still want to talk about funding. It's very important. Refugees, they have got a lot of things, ambitions. There are small initiatives that they do in the community, but there are no funding So we need to advocate for funding. And we cannot talk about climate crisis leaving issues to do with clean cooking. This is something we should echo on, because refugees in Uganda really have difficult access to clean cooking. In my settlement where I live, some families cook using plastic bottles, imagine. And that exposed them to more risk. And due to lack of specialized medical services, these things at some point, it leads to really disastrous situations. So going to COP29, I think we still have to advocate for refugee representation at a higher level, so that they are able to report really what they need and how they can be supported. It's very important that when we talk about refugees, we have them in place to give us the right information. And for me, I think that is something we should prioritize, but also international community should help refugees also advocate for policy inclusion, because when it comes to policy inclusion, it depends on political will, right? So sometimes it's above refugees. It is not something that refugees can just stand up and say, no, we need to be included. So that should come from international organizations. They should approach the government and see how refugees can actually be included, like in National Development Planning Committee in Uganda, you know, at least so that policies are inclusive. This will actually help in quicker response in case climate crisis happen in refugee areas. So yeah, I think this is how I can answer those questions. But thank you so much for today. I think it's very important, and I love the comment from Jackson. He mentioned something about the South Sudan adaptation policy, which is inclusive. I'm a South Sudanese, and I take that as a distinction. I am proud to hear about that. For me, I know like Uganda is the only country that have inclusive policies, but if South Sudan is also moving to that direction, then yeah, that's mean we are moving to the right direction. Thank you so much. And I wish you can share that in the chat so that we also look at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayo. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and all of those who have tuned in to listen today to this conversation. We wish it could go on much longer. Jason, perhaps you can share that resource in the chat, and perhaps we can continue advocating for Uganda to include refugees in their national adaptation plan as it's developed this year. So apologies for not getting to every question that was asked, but we would be happy to continue the conversation if you follow us on social media or on our newsletters and emails for CGD and Refugees International. Again, this is a shared project. Many thanks to our funders, IKEA and the Hilton Foundation, the IKEA Foundation and the Hilton Foundation for supporting this work. And Evan, Jason, Michelle, Lillian, Atle, Kiamudin, Jamin, and Ayo, thank you for being here with us today. Your insights are so appreciated, and we know there's a lot of work to do, from collecting and analyzing data to financing to building political will and changing policy in all of these areas. And as one of our commenters in the chat pointed out, most importantly, stopping climate change at its source. Climate mitigation work is critical to ensuring that adaptation work, loss and damage disaster response does not continue to get worse and worse and worse, as well as supporting refugees in all that they need and all that they're doing. So from Refugees International, thank you to all of you. Sam, Huckstep, and the entire Center for Global Development team, thank you, and hope you all have a wonderful day.